There are three reasons to punish: deterrence, rehabilitation and retribution. In Scotland, they're following the liberal trend of ignoring deterrence and retribution and thinking that punishment is all about rehabilitation, in which case it ceases to be punishment in a certain sense. This creates problems in government policy. It creates problems in the way they treat families, for example with the smacking ban. It creates problems with how they deal with disciplinary issues in school, and it creates problems in the criminal justice system. The idea of deterrence is quite straightforward. The basic principle of deterrence is it provides an input to the decision-making process of someone you wish to steer away from a certain course of action. Fine. Rehabilitation, that's the idea. You want to take someone who's done something wrong, you want to change their character, help them to see the error of their ways so that they're going to be the sort of person who's not going to do the same sort of thing again. The last rationale for punishment, desert, is also very intuitive and will be accepted by most people, but is currently unpopular in lots of circles. The basic idea of justice is that if people have done something wrong, they deserve punishment. Retribution can be explained like this. The idea that wrongdoers should be paid back for their wicked deeds fits naturally with many people's feelings. They find it deeply satisfying when murderers and rapists get what they have coming, and they are infuriated when villains get away with it. But others dismiss these feelings as primitive and unenlightened. Now notice there, this is not about revenge or vengeance. That conjures the idea of mistreating someone in order to satisfy an emotional desire to see them hurt because they've hurt you. It's not about revenge. It's not an emotional thing. It's to do with justice. People who commit such crimes as murder and rape deserve to be punished, and this alone is sufficient to justify punishing them. It's not merely that punishing them satisfies certain sorts of vengeful feelings. On the contrary, it's a violation of justice if murderers and rapists are allowed to walk away as if they'd done nothing. Now, this feeling that wrongdoing deserves punishment, that law-breaking deserves punishment, is a very strong intuition. Let's say it's an intuition, it's an aspect of our conscience. Now, some people might say, oh, we can't just go by our feelings, by our conscience, by our intuition. We need logic and facts to go on. But actually, ultimately, there are only two foundations on which to build moral reasoning. One is religious beliefs, the other one is our conscience, our intuitions. I don't want to go into that here. If someone wants to disagree with that, put a comment in and I'll happily debate it there. But our moral intuitions are the foundation of our moral thinking. There are costs associated with law abidance. Law-abiding people have accepted a burden, inconvenient constraints on their conduct, which the lawbreaker has not accepted. Meanwhile, the lawbreaker has had benefits denied to others. Presumably his illegal conduct was undertaken because there was profit of some kind in it for him. Punishment corrects things in the direction of greater equality. That is why it's commonly said the crime upsets the scales of justice and the punishing wrongdoers restores the balance. Murder, theft and the like cannot be left as matters of individual discretion, so to ensure compliance with such rules we attach sanctions to them. We do not say, please do not murder, we say, you must not murder or else. Now I think what's happening particularly in schools, and the Scottish Government would like it to happen in families as well, is they would like us to say, please do not. Rather than having a rule and a punishment, they would rather it just be a request, rather than this is the rule, and if you don't follow it, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to run through a little assessment now of these three motivations for punishment: deterrence, rehabilitation and retribution. And I'm going to assess them on the basis of 4 desirable traits of a justice system. These are the desirable traits. A justice system, a criminal justice system, it could be a disciplinary system in a school as well, should only punish the guilty. That's pretty straightforward, isn't it? There should be equal treatment. If Joe drives his car at 100 miles an hour on the high street, if Fred's just behind him driving at 100 miles an hour, they should be in line for the same punishment, obviously. Proportionality. The more serious the crime, the more serious the punishment should be. The punishment fits the crime. Again, completely straightforward and obvious, but that's a desirable feature of a justice system. The last one, excuses. Should mitigating circumstances be considered? Yes, they should. Maybe the person wasn't entirely responsible for their actions, and it's quite right that that should be considered in assessing the punishment that should be given. Right, let's see how these different motivations for punishment fare against these 4 criteria. Right, number 1, deterrence. If your sole purpose with punishment is deterrence, should you only punish the guilty? Well, actually, no. The important thing with deterrence is that you punish someone who people think is guilty. So if there's been a murder, for example, from a deterrence point of view, it's better to punish someone who didn't do it, but people think they did it, rather than for the crime to go unsolved, because that doesn't have any deterrent effect. So deterrence, only punish the guilty? Not necessarily. Right, equal treatment. If 2 people have done the same thing, should they be given the same punishment? Well, yes, the principle of deterrence does meet that criteria. Right, proportionality. Should the severity of the punishment reflect the seriousness of the crime? If your sole criteria is deterrence, then no, not necessarily. Imagine if it was discovered that a 1-year jail sentence was just as good a deterrence for murder as a life sentence. Then from a deterrence point of view, a 1-year sentence for murder would be the logical option. How about if it was also discovered that to stop people driving at 25 miles an hour in 20-mile-an-hour zones around their home, the necessary punishment was a year in prison? That's what it took to get people to drive that slowly. Then if your sole criteria is deterrence, that would be the punishment. So proportionality, no. Right, excuses. Would you take into account mitigating circumstances if your sole intention was deterrence? Well, no, you wouldn't. Because if someone's driving at 100 miles an hour, say, but then they've got an excuse, they were rushing to the hospital or whatever, and they seem to get away with it. They drove at 100 miles an hour, but they didn't get the punishment. That undermines deterrence. Someone else driving at 100 miles an hour might think, maybe this excuse will get me off the hook. They would be more deterred if they knew nothing gets you off the hook for it. So taking into account excuses, if deterrence is your sole criteria, no. So deterrence, 1 out of 4. Now let's look at rehabilitation. This is where the Scottish Government is laying all of its focus at the moment. Huge emphasis. It's all about rehabilitation. Right, if it's just about rehabilitation, do you only punish the guilty? No. If it's about rehabilitation, you would deal with people you think are going to commit crimes in the future. It might be that someone commits a terrible crime, but you have every reason to think that was due to a unique set of circumstances, and there's nothing in that person's character that's going to ever lead them to do that again. So you wouldn't punish them. On the other hand, if you take someone and do a DNA test and a personality test, and you recognise that they're the sort of person that's very likely to commit a crime in the future, then maybe you would put them in prison in order to reform them. So in rehabilitation, do you only punish the guilty? No. Do you treat people equally? So again, we've got 2 people driving at 100 miles an hour along the high street, let's say. Again, one of them might regret it instantly and think, what an idiot I was, and they will see that he's never going to do that again. Whereas the other one might be as stubborn as anything, he'll refuse to accept he's done anything wrong. So would they have equal treatment, equal sentences? No. They could be very different sentences for the same crime. Now, proportionality. Again, if your sole aim is rehabilitation, would the, for example, length of a prison sentence reflect the seriousness of the crime? And the answer is no. It would reflect the amount of time it takes to change someone so they're not going to commit that crime again. So it could be that someone who's in prison for a relatively minor crime might be there for 30 years because they just seem like they can't be reformed, their attitude can't be changed, whereas someone who's committed a very, very serious crime, if they can show all the signs of having learnt the lesson and changed their character, they might be released virtually immediately if they're sent to prison at all. Now the last one, if you're just about rehabilitation, would you accept excuses? Well, yes, you would. In fact, that's the only one of these factors that you would accept. And you see, that's what happens. When rehabilitation is your sole focus, your specialism becomes listening to people's excuses, which is a valid part of a justice system. But if that's the only one you're accepting, then that gets out of hand. You can see that in the criminal justice system. You can see it in restorative practice at school, where people are falling over themselves to help people find reasons for their behaviour other than personal moral responsibility. Right, finally, let's look at retribution. People deserve punishment because they've done something wrong or because they've broken the law. Right, you only punish the guilty. Well, of course you do. That's the whole point. They deserve the punishment because they're guilty. Do you treat people equally for equal crimes? Well, of course you do. That's the principle of justice. That makes perfect sense. Proportionality. Well, yes, of course. If someone has done something minor, they deserve a minor punishment. If someone's done something much more serious, they deserve a much more serious punishment. It's just a part of the simple logic of retribution. Should you accept excuses? Should you look into mitigating circumstances? Well, yes, definitely, because that could reduce the magnitude of someone's guilt if they weren't entirely personally responsible for their actions. So to summarise the scoreboard, deterrence 1 out of 4, rehabilitation 1 out of 4, retribution 4 out of 4. If retribution is not a part of your rationale for punishment, you end up with some very strange justice systems in place. In Scotland, we're heading towards the stage where the dominant view is that no one's really to blame for their actions. Behaviour is caused rather than chosen. So the way someone behaves, if they commit a crime, it's because of society, it's because of their parents. It's a case of mental malfunction rather than moral malevolence. This is a dehumanising view. Now, if your car doesn't work, you just take it to the garage and try and get them to fix it to make it work. You don't say you're a bad car. Come on, car, you should know better. Try and do better next time. But they're wanting to treat people like that. They're not treating people as moral agents. This view is founded on the belief that we're basically biochemical machines that might have a faulty algorithm or two. But part of what's unique about being human is the capacity for moral decision making and the consequent moral responsibility. From the model the Scottish Government seems to be adopting tacitly, we're going to go soft on crime. The criminal justice system will become softer and softer, apart from, of course, for crimes against women, where they seem to be emphasising that the sentences are going to be harsher and harsher. Within schools, we'll see discipline breaking down because schools won't be able to implement effective disciplinary systems. And at home, we look at the smacking ban. I think a lot of the people who are supporting the smacking ban, it's not just that they're against smacking. If you talk to them, they're actually against the idea of punishment full stop. So don't think they're going to stop after the smacking ban. This direction is going to continue, and there'll be more and more restrictions on what parents are allowed to do in terms of disciplining their children. What I've done in this video is try to take a step back and look at the philosophical foundations of some of Scottish political life. And there are some serious problems there. Now, this sort of video is not going to get viewed by a huge number of people. Videos about, say, the latest transgender nuttiness are going to get more people watching. But we're not going to get our nation back on the rails without knowing where those rails are. And we've got to fight back one argument at a time. Now, obviously, even in a democracy, even if you win every argument, that doesn't do you any good if people still vote for parties that take the other view. People need to start voting for the truth. The argument I presented in this video, have you ever heard anything, will you ever hear anything like it from any of the other parties in the Scottish Parliament? Of course you won't. Just as a side comment, some people might be thinking about this system of justice I've talked about and wonder about the place of forgiveness or mercy. Now, I would say, I think C.S. Lewis said actually, that mercy can only grow in the cracks between the rocks of justice. The very conceptions of forgiveness and mercy don't make any sense without a background acknowledgement of the system of justice and retribution that I've outlined here. So forgiveness and mercy certainly have a place and they can be very valuable things, but they make sense with the background of what I've explained. Now, the argument I presented here is basically from a philosopher by the name of James Rachels. I'll put a link below if you want to read the full essay. I don't agree with everything in the essay, particularly his comments about forgiveness, but it is a very insightful piece nonetheless. Well, thanks for watching. Do subscribe to us on YouTube if you find this sort of thing interesting. We're a political party. There's a link below where you can join us, and there's also a link where you can make a donation that would be much appreciated. Thanks.